A reading of Habakkuk chapter 1, the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. Habakkuk's complaint. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abound. Therefore, the law is paralyzed. The justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. The Lord's answer. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you're told. I am raising up the Babylonians, the ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, sweeping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen rams, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is in their God. Habakkuk's second complaint. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoings. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? This is God's word.
We're starting a new sermon series today. For the next few weeks, we'll be in the prophet Habakkuk. And Habakkuk, as Old Testament prophets go, is unique because most of the prophets of the Old Testament received a message from God that they brought to the people. But Habakkuk's message is his own wrestling with God, his own struggle with God. And as I'll show you today and in the weeks to come, what Habakkuk is wrestling with God about is suffering. He's wrestling with God about his own suffering, and he's wrestling with God about the suffering he sees all around him, his people falling apart, the decay and spiritual bankruptcy and the violence that's all around him. This is a book about a prophet who's wrestling with God about suffering. And wherever you are on your spiritual journey, some of you have followed God for a long time. Others of you are maybe exploring the claims of the Christian faith. A fact of life is suffering. And one of the things that the book of Habakkuk does is it challenges us to wrestle with God in our suffering, or to ask, do we have the resources in our lives to handle suffering? In my own spiritual journey, the book of Habakkuk has been a close friend to me. Habakkuk has become something of a spiritual guide. When I was younger, my family went through a significant personal tragedy. And in the aftermath of that, I remember asking way more than once, why would God let this happen? Now, at the time, I was part of a nominally religious family. Church was part of our life, but it certainly wasn't core, it wasn't center. And yet, when deep suffering came crashing into my world, the question that I most instinctively asked is, why would God let this happen? There was a sense I had that there is a God out there and that he could have done something to prevent this, and he didn't. Suffering and my relationship to God. As a minister, one of my privileges, if you could call it that, is to walk with people through some of their deepest suffering when they go through the shadow. And sometimes I see people who suffer, and that suffering causes them to question God's existence. Is God even out there? But I must say that much more common as I walk with people through suffering, much more frequently I see people not start to question God's existence, but to doubt his goodness. I know he's out there, but he obviously doesn't care about me. C.S. Lewis, when he went through his own personal tragedy, put it this way: it's not that I'm in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion that I fear is not, well, so there's no God after all, but instead, so this is what God is really like. Deceive yourself no longer. Suffering is a fact of life. We'll all suffer. But what Habakkuk can be is a friend on a spiritual journey to show us how to keep trusting in God, or how to start trusting in God when life is hard. He opens his soul and gives us a window in how he learned to trust God through deep suffering and shadow. And he invites us to see and to journey with him. And that journey starts, of course, in chapter 1. Let's look at this passage today. And let me show you hard questions that Habakkuk asks, spiritual discipline the people of God need, and the friend that sticks closer than a brother. Hard questions, spiritual discipline, and the friend. It's all here in chapter 1. Let's take a look. First, Habakkuk's journey of learning to trust God when life is hard begins with asking hard questions. And you see the questions there in verse 2 and then verse 3. He says first, how long? And then later he says, why? Those are the perennial questions of sufferers. How long and why? Now, in Habakkuk's story, the background is this. He's a prophet. He's looking at his nation. And as you see in the verses, the people are growing in wickedness. There's violence. And so Habakkuk's suffering is seeing his people turn from God, live for themselves, and the moral and spiritual decay that's coming into their community. And it's grieving him. It's breaking his heart. But notice that by the time we get the book of Habakkuk, he's not saying, how long will we be like this? Or why aren't we changing? Notice his questions are directed to God. Because his suffering now is not just the circumstances of his life, but God's absence in the midst of those circumstances. He's wrestling with God's inactivity. And if you're on any kind of spiritual journey, sooner or later you'll find yourself going through seasons of suffering where God's absence feels acute. We don't know how long Habakkuk was in this state. How long? Why? But it must have been long enough because the intensity of his prayer reveals that Habakkuk is what some writers have called experiencing a dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is a season, not an event, in which God's absence is acute, your spiritual sight is blurred, where at the same time you're desperate for God's presence and he feels terribly far away, distant. And that's where Habakkuk is. He's in a spiritual dark night of the soul. And as I've said, sooner or later, for anyone who's on a spiritual journey, you'll find yourself in these places. You'll find yourself in the dark night. And when you are, or as you currently are, remember Habakkuk. It should be of some comfort to us that even the authors of the Bible had dark nights of soul. Psalm 42, the author says, "My soul is like a deer panting for water." The image is of a deer going down to a riverbed. It's all dried up. And he says, that's what God has become like to me. I'm panting, I'm thirsting, I'm spiritually dying of thirst, and God is nowhere to be found. Even Jesus, as I'll show you later, had a dark night of soul, the darkest of nights. And so if or when you're in the dark night of soul, know that you're not alone, and that should be of some comfort. And in those moments, the most frequent words in prayer are things like, how long and why? That's where Habakkuk is in his first complaint, in verses 2 through 4. But finally, we don't know how much time elapses, but finally we get to verse 5 and God speaks. God replies. But notice what God says, starting in verse 5. God says to Habakkuk, look at the nations, be utterly amazed. I'm going to do something that you wouldn't believe, even if it were told to you. I am raising up the Babylonians. Now, remember, Habakkuk is grieved about what's happening in his nation. He wants God to intervene. He wants justice. He wants there to be healing. So he's crying out to God. And God says, finally, I hear you. I'm going to do something that you wouldn't believe. I'm raising up the Babylonians. The Babylonians were a violent, gruesomely wicked people. They would invade and they would conquer and they would be inhumane. There would be no justice. There would be no decency. There would be no humanity. And God says, they're going to be the instruments of my justice. I see what's happening and I'm sending the Babylonians. And that's what verses 5 through 11 are about. So come to verse 12. You see Habakkuk's second complaint. Habakkuk's absorbing the news. God's going to send the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says in verse 12 and then into verse 13, Lord, are you not from everlasting? Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those who are more righteous than themselves? Now, there's a fair bit of prophetic poetry in there, but let me paraphrase what Habakkuk's saying to God. Are you kidding me right now? I mean, connect the dots. Habakkuk is praying and he's saying, God, do something. And God says, I will. I'm going to send the Babylonians. And as soon as Habakkuk hears that, he starts absorbing the news. He's plunged into a state of spiritual disorientation, profound spiritual confusion. He's been longing for God to speak and to show up, and when God does, his situation gets harder and seems even more bleak. He initially was wrestling with God's inactivity, but now he's wrestling with God's inexplicability. This makes no sense. I don't get it. I mean, yes, we're wicked. Yes, we need justice, he's saying, but you're going to send the Babylonians? They're 10 times worse than us. What Habakkuk is doing in these verses is he's processing out loud his spiritual disorientation. He cannot reconcile what he thinks he knows about God with what's happening in his life. It makes no sense. And he's plunged into a state of kind of shock, not able to reconciling what he thinks he knows about God with what's happening all around him. Now, that's chapter 1. And some of you are thinking, okay, this is totally horrible. Let's get to chapter 2 as fast as possible. But not so fast. We have to sit with Habakkuk here in chapter 1 for a couple reasons. Here's one. This is often what spiritual life feels like. Suffering. Suffering that you can't make sense of. Suffering where you pray why and how long, and you feel spiritually disoriented, and when God does seem to work or seem to respond or seem to act, things don't often get easier, they get harder, more confusing. This is a reality of spiritual life, and we have to see it. We have to be prepared for it. But here's the other reason why we can't rush past chapter 1. We will see eventually in coming Sundays how God meets Habakkuk. But we have to sit here today because if we're willing to sit with Habakkuk in the pain of chapter 1, we discover that actually right in front of us is this profoundly important spiritual discipline that we all need. It's been a profoundly important spiritual discipline for the people of God throughout their existence, and we needed to. What is it? Well, have you noticed that in chapter 1, Habakkuk is angry, he's questioning, he's complaining, but do you notice that all of it is in the form of prayer? He's not just complaining, but he's complaining to God. He's bringing God his shock and his anger and his grief and his pain and his confusion. He's praying. And this kind of prayer has a name. It's called lament. Chapter 1 is Habakkuk lamenting or engaging in the spiritual discipline of lament. Brenda Salter McNeil, one of my professors from school, put it this way: lament means talking to God about what is wrong with the world. It's not just complaining, it's not just voicing suffering, but it's doing it towards God. Lament is the kind of prayer, it's the form of prayer that comes out of a person whose heart is breaking because they see a world that's not as it should be. And this is one of the spiritual disciplines that God has given to his people to shape them, to help them see brokenness, and to be spiritually formed in the midst of that brokenness. Take, for example, the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is the prayer book of the Bible. John Calvin said it's like a mirror to the soul. Every possible human emotion is there in the book of Psalms. So throughout the Psalms, you have all genres of prayer, of these poems that people write to pray. You have thanksgiving psalms where people are praising God for who he is and all that he's done. You have supplication psalms where people are asking for God to do something. They're requesting. You have confession psalms where people are confessing their sin and their evil. But don't you know that far and away, the single largest genre in the Psalms is lament? The thing that the people of God do in prayer more than any other, if we're shaped by the book of Psalms, is they lament. They talk to God about their suffering. They bring their anger. They bring their confusion. They bring their pain. They run to God with their lament. And you know, for New Yorkers, I think this is a challenge. New Yorkers are doers, we're fixers, we're solvers. We have lots of power, and many of us love control. And suffering, oh boy, suffering exposes all of those idols. It makes you feel like the ground beneath your feet is completely shaky. But what we try to do when we suffer oftentimes is we try to fix, we try to solve, we try to work around. Lament is an invitation to sit in the suffering, to sit in the pain, and to bring it all to God. And that's what Habakkuk is showing us here in chapter 1. And there are a lot of great resources out there on lament. And if you want to learn more about lament, the spiritual prayer practice of lament, find me after. I'm happy to point you in the direction of some of those resources. But in our sermon today, I want to very briefly give you two components that, if you keep them together, are always the foundation for lament. One without the other, not lament. But if you hold these two things together, you have the foundation for lament in your prayer life. So here they are: honesty and theology. So first, honesty. You notice in chapter 1 that Habakkuk is being brutally honest with God. He's, if you would, sparing no punches. He's not sugarcoating anything. He's saying to God exactly what he feels and exactly how what he feels is bothering him, is shaking him. It's as Shakespeare said at the end of King Lear, the weight of this sad time we must obey, speak what we feel and not what we ought to say. Habakkuk is not doing any religious politeness. If you were at a prayer meeting and you heard someone like Habakkuk praying the way Habakkuk is praying, probably you'd feel a little uncomfortable. Like, can we say that to God? But that's what he's doing. Why? He's being honest. And lament is always an invitation to honesty, to bring your whole real self, whatever you're feeling, to God. And the great Psalms of lament in the Bible, they show us this in ways that should make us blush. So Psalm 88, for example, one of the great laments in the Bible, put it this way: "May my prayer come before you. Listen to me. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Why, Lord, are you rejecting me? Why do you hide your face from me? I have borne your terror, and I am in despair." When was the last time you were at a prayer meeting and you heard someone pray, "I am in your terror and despair"? But the fact is, many of us feel that way. And lament, the invitation to lament, is a challenge to honesty. Why? Because in a real relationship, you've got to be honest about how you're feeling. You know, if someone comes to you and says, "How you doing?" and you say, "I'm great," but actually your life's falling apart, that relationship can only be superficial. And that might be fine with some people, but it can never be fine with God. A real relationship with God requires us to be honest about what we're actually feeling. Because only when we open up our real self to Him is there any hope that He can actually meet that real self. Lament starts with honesty. But not just honesty, you also need, coupled with that right there, theology. Theology. In all of his suffering, Habakkuk hasn't forgotten his doctrine of God. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who has a British preacher, 20th century, has a remarkable set of sermons on the book of Habakkuk. And he says, and he would know because he's British, he says, if you're hiking in various parts of the UK, you'll often find yourself walking through the moorlands or through bogs. These are places that from a distance look safe, but when you get into them, you realize they're completely uneven, the terrain is very varied, and there's often places where you can sink, lose your footing. So Lloyd-Jones says the only way to negotiate those places is you have to find solid places to plant your feet. And only in finding those solid places will you then be able to take step by step. Lloyd-Jones says, look at what Habakkuk's doing. It's almost as if he's spiritually sinking. So what's he do? He goes back to his theology. He goes back to his doctrine of God. He says, this is how I'm feeling, but God, this is what you say is true about you. Look at verse 12. Habakkuk is praying in verse 12, and he says, God, you're eternal. You're outside of time. What I'm experiencing right now feels overwhelming to me, but you see the end from the beginning. He says, you're holy. I don't understand how you're working, but your eyes are too holy to look on anything impure. You must have a plan in this. And then he says, you're a rock. You're almighty. You're a stable place in the midst of uncertain times. In other words, Lloyd-Jones saying, with every step, Habakkuk is going back to his theology, and he's saying, everything around me is shaking and giving way, so I have to remember what God says about himself. And he holds these things together, honesty and theology. This is how I'm feeling, and God, this is what you say is true. And don't you see, if you keep those things together, then lament is never without hope. Lament is never just a form of despair. Biblical lament is a spiritually formative act in which we're more honest about our suffering and more aware of God's glory than we might have otherwise been. That's why Cole Riley, in one of her recent books, put it this way: lament itself is a form of hope. It's an innate awareness that what is should not be. And so in the rubble, we say to God, you promised. Holding God to account, declaring what he says to be true about himself and his promises. This is the spiritually formative practice of lament, and it's what Habakkuk is showing us, and we need it. But at this moment, a question might surface in our minds, and that's to ask, well, why is Habakkuk even bothering? He's bothered with God. He's struggling with God. God's absence has been confusing to him. Now God's activity is confusing to him. Why doesn't he just walk away? Why does he keep pressing in? Why does he continue wrestling? Well, the answer is in verse 12, another clue. Habakkuk knew that God wasn't just eternal, wasn't just holy, wasn't just a rock, but Habakkuk also knew that God was his friend, the ultimate friend, the friend that sticks closer than a brother. You say, what do I mean? Look again at verse 12. You may not see it in the printed versions that you have, but in verse 12, God calls Habakkuk Lord. And that word Lord, usually in English Bibles, is in all capitals. And that's the translator's way of telling you that that word is the word Yahweh. You see, the word God is the generic name for God, the super powerful being in the sky. But Yahweh is the name that God gave to his people when he made a covenant with them. When he said, I'm with you, I'll be your God and you'll be my people. And he made promises to them. When God entered into a relationship with his people, when God, if you would, became their friend. And as Habakkuk is suffering, when he prays, he's saying, God, you said you'd be our friend. You made promises. You made a covenant. And I'm holding you to it. And that's why Habakkuk doesn't walk away. Because he remembers the friendship of God. He remembers that in God you have a friend who sticks closer than a brother, and that changes everything when you're in the dark night. There's a great scene in one of the episodes of the TV show The West Wing where one of the characters is having a personal crisis and he's afraid of losing his job. So his boss, who's also a friend, comes to him and says, let me tell you a story. And he says, there's a guy walking along and he falls into a hole. And he's in the hole and he's stuck, he can't get out. So a doctor walks by and the guy says, hey doc, I'm stuck in the hole, can you help me out? And the doc writes a prescription, throws it in the hole, walks on by. A few minutes later, a priest walks by and the man says, hey father, I'm stuck in this hole, can you help me out? The priest writes down a prayer, throws it in the hole, walks on by. But then finally, a friend walks by. And the guy says, hey, Joe, it's me. Can you help me out? And the friend jumps into the hole with him. And he says, what are you doing? Now we're both stuck down here. And the friend says, yes, but I've been down here before and I know the way out. When you're in the hole, when you're in the dark night of soul, you need a friend. A friend who's willing to jump in there with you, to comfort you, but also a friend who says, I know the way out. I've been down here before, and there's hope. There's life on the other side of this. When Habakkuk is praying and he says to God, you're Yahweh, you made promises, you made a covenant, you're the friend. What Habakkuk could only see dimly, we can see clearly. There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Jesus Christ, on the night before his death, was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he knelt down to pray. And when he knelt down to pray, with his death soon coming, Jesus said to God his Father, is there any other way? Is there any other way we can do this? Notice that Jesus asked his Father a hard question. And in that moment, Jesus got no answer. He got no reply. For all the ways that we ask God, how much longer and why is this happening? Jesus asked hard questions and got silence. And yet in trust and obedience, he surrenders himself to his Father. He goes to the cross. And on the cross, Jesus, dying, lamented. On the cross, Jesus prays Psalm 22, which is one of the great laments of the Bible. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus laments. He cries out to God in his spiritual confusion, his spiritual agony, and he gets silence. He gets no answer. In the garden and on the cross, Jesus Christ was plunged into the darkest of all dark nights of the soul. Christianity is unique among religions in the world in that salvation is secured by God who became man, and that God becoming man suffered and lamented. That he himself actually experienced a spiritual dark night of the soul. why can you trust God when life is hard? Only when you see Jesus lamenting for you. Because he was actually and cosmically forsaken, we would only ever feel forsaken. You see, God became man to be with us in ours. He jumped into the hole. And he says, I know the way out. The cross is the ultimate proof of how far God in Christ went to be with us in our suffering and to end our suffering, to heal it. Now, this doesn't, in the moment, address all the questions we might have in the midst of suffering, but it can't mean that he doesn't love us. And it can't mean that we're alone. Because God became man in Jesus Christ to jump into that hole with us, to say, I'm with you, I'll always be with you, and I know the way out. How do we start trusting God when life is hard? We look to Jesus Christ. We remember his promises. We see the cross. And we're reminded that we have the ultimate friend who sticks closer than a brother. At the end of the 19th century, there was a woman called Louisa Steed who, with her husband and young daughter, went to the beach for a sunny day at the beach. And what started off as a sunny day quickly became, for Louisa, the darkest night that she'd ever had. Let me read to you what one historian said. While eating their picnic lunch, the family suddenly heard cries of help, and they spotted a drowning boy in the sea. So Louisa's husband charged into the water. But as often happens, however, the struggling boy pulled his rescuer underwater with him, and they both drowned before the terrified eyes of wife and daughter. So Louisa said, why? And she struggled with God in the days that followed. And she wrote a hymn. And the hymn that she wrote is known to many of you. It's "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." And the last stanza of that hymn says, I'm so glad that I learned how to trust thee. Precious Jesus, Savior, friend. I know that you are with me and will be with me to the end. Louisa Steed, Habakkuk, the authors of the psalm, they learned how to trust God when life was hard. And we can too. And it starts by looking to Jesus, who lamented with you, who lamented for you, and who was actually forsaken so that we never ultimately would be. Look to Jesus Christ, the friend who sticks closer than a brother. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you for helping us this morning to not only think about the message of Habakkuk, but to experience its power. And so now, as we come to this time of singing, as we come to this time of response, help us to see Jesus, a friend. Help us to know his promises. Help us to be honest with our suffering. May we experience something of your comfort, especially for those of us who are at this moment in dark nights of soul. Lord, help us as a church to trust you in the sunny days and in the darkest nights. Help us to see Jesus in all he's done. We ask this in his name and for his glory. Amen.